Hey everyone, it is the second Wednesday of the month of July in the year 2016, and on every second Wednesday of every month of the year, I bring you guys a budget MTG video. Is a series where I present you guys with a budget build of mine that's purpose is to be competitive at Friday Night Magic against Tier 1, but at a much lower price tag than most Tier 1 decks. And this deck is a very fun one. I've had to do a lot of testing. I haven't done Modern in a while. And I've been trying to come up with a modern competitive deck for a while, and this is the one I finally brewed, basically. And it's a green-white Enchantress deck, and it is a lot of fun to play. If you don't know what Enchantress decks are, if you're not, don't play Legacy or not someone who hasn't played Magic for a really long time, it's basically an enchantment-based deck that runs Enchantress effects, which are effects that draw you cards every time you play an enchantment. So that's what this deck tries to do, is play an Enchantress, play a bunch of enchantments, and draw cards. And then we win the game with something like Sigil of the Empty Throne, which every time I play an enchantment spell gives me a 4/4 Angel, or with Heliod, God of the Sun. The deck actually had Myth Realized in it at one point as well, but it had huge dyssynergy with another card in the deck that I took out. It is a decent win condition, depending on your metagame, though, Myth Realized. But instead, I just run basically 4 win conditions in the deck, but they get the job done, as you'll see in the gameplay videos. We'll talk about the lands real quick. We have 4 Temple Gardens, 4 Sun Petal Groves, and that's where it ends for our fancy, expensive lands. In fact, Sun Petal Grove is not that expensive. Temple Garden is. We have 1 Nykthos, because we play a lot of permanents. And then we have 7 basic forests and 6 basic plains. Playing as many basic forests as you can is kind of important, and I'll tell you why, and it's because of Utopia Sprawl. Utopia Sprawl is a great enchantment that allows us to play a second turn Enchantress if we have a forest in play on turn 1. So we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 main board forests. You can probably do a little better. But since we have so much double white in the deck, it was a little dangerous to play more. I mean, I guess potentially the battle lands could be good in this deck because they happen to also be forests. So that's something to think about. But so the deck basically tries to lock our opponent out of the game one way or another while we slowly assemble a bunch of cards in our hand and one of our win conditions. And it also plays low-costed enchantments, so we can easily get triggers on our enchantresses. And one of them is Oath of Nissa, a new addition to the deck. I had Vessel of Nascency in the deck at one point. I tested with both of them. In the end, I decided on Oath of Nissa. The Vessel can actually hit enchantments, and Oath of Nissa can't. But Oath of Nissa can hit us, our Heliod, who's a win condition, and all of our enchantresses and other creatures. And it's also a 1-mana enchantment that can make sure we hit a land drop. It can make sure we get a trigger out of Sigil of the Empty Throne and an enchantress if those are in play for a very cheap cost. Then we have the Sprawl that I mentioned, another low-costed enchantment that once you have Sigil or an enchantress in play gets to be kind of ridiculous. And it lets you play turn 2 enchantress or turn 2 any of these other 3-drops. We have 2 Journey to Nowheres. They're just a very good removal spell. I mean, it's no Path to Exile, but in this deck, we don't want Path to Exile. We want all of our cards that aren't creatures, and some of them are actually enchantments, but we want as many enchantments in our deck as possible because once we have our stuff online, it gives us a huge number of benefits. Also, it deals well with cards that are played regularly, like Kitchen Finks, Hangerback Walker to a certain degree, cards like that it can just exile and you don't have to worry about. We have 4 suppression fields main board. Now, there are a lot of decks in Modern that just cannot beat a turn 2 suppression field. Decks that run a lot of fetch lands, like Suicide Zoo, is in a lot of trouble if you play a turn 2 suppression field. Thopter Foundry decks basically lose to suppression field. It stops fetch lands. It stops a lot of activated abilities that are around in the format, and I think that's really important. So I mainboard 4 of them because it's such good mainboard hate, and we don't run fetch lands because they're expensive, and because it would be dyssynergistic with our suppression fields, that's one of the biggest things they hate on is fetch lands. We also have 4 Herald of the Pantheons, we have 2 fairly new cards in this deck, the Oath and the Herald, and it is pretty great. It lets us play Sigil of the Empty Throne earlier. It lets us play more enchantments a turn if we're drawing a bunch of cards and have an Enchantress in play. And we get to gain life for all of them, which helps give us more time against aggro decks. This deck has a lot of turns because of the Enchantresses that last a really long time because you just keep chaining together enchantments. And you gain, 5 or 6 life in that turn, and that can be a real thing that happens. Another hate card, it kind of goes along with Suppression Field, which hates on a lot of more control-y decks with activated abilities. It's also good against Affinity, which is an aggro deck. But Ghostly Prison is good against aggro. If you stick this against a lot of aggro decks, they can't win, or at least you slow them down so much that you have plenty of time to get your Sigil online, and once they finally have enough mana to start attacking, they have to deal with an army of 4/4 angels. So Ghostly Prison's great. We run a full 4 of them. Sometimes it's right to side them out, but it's not even just good against aggro decks. It's good against any deck that wins by swinging. It's good against Delver. It's even good against Thopter Foundry because they want to swing with all of their 1/1 flyers. It's good against mid-range and aggro decks. What it's bad against are things like Ad Nauseam. Any combo deck who's like, whatever, I'm never going to attack you, but I'll win this game. But what's good against Ad Nauseam, another card that hates on, is Suppression Field, because they like to play Lightning Storm, and they have to pay 2 mana every time they want to discard a land to Lightning Storm to try to kill you. So Suppression Field and Ghostly Prison are sort of our hate package. They hate on, the two of them together hate on most of the metagame. We have 2 Oblivion Rings main board because they can deal with Planeswalkers or enchantments or artifacts that are problems, like Thopter Foundry, for example. We have 4 Mesa Enchantresses to get into our Enchantress effects. We have 8 copies of Enchantresses, 4 Mesa, 4 Verderon, and they, are sort of the backbone of the deck that allows us to win the game with massive amounts of card advantage. We also run 2 Courses of Crewfix main board. I had 4 at one point, but I decided 2 was enough. We have enough hate against aggro in the deck that we don't need like 4 Courses of Crewfix, but they are good in the deck. They're an enchantment for one thing, and for another thing, they gain us life, which is something we want to do. We want to get to the later part of the game. And finally, they help us get to more enchantments by getting our lands off the top of our library. So they're pretty good. And then we have our win conditions. We have Heliod, who becomes a creature pretty frequently, and it can also make enchantments, and it also gives Vigilance to all my angels, which is pretty unbeatable too because I can attack with them all and block. So it's great in the deck. It can actually be hit by Oath of Nissa, which is a plus side because our Sigil cannot, and it can sometimes just win the game for us. But Sigil is the best win condition that we have. Like I said, we have turns that can last a very long time, especially if we have like a Herald and Enchantress in play. So we can play lots of enchantments for cheap, and suddenly we put 3 or 4 angels into play in one turn, and we have lethal in the air against our opponent on the next turn. Our sideboard is very important. One of the best things about playing an Enchantress deck is there are lots of silver bullets that you can run that are good against certain decks that are enchantments, so they're even better in your deck than they would be against other people. Let's sort this by converted mana cost first. So we do have 2 Pithing Needles, which in fact are not enchantments, but I am recording this, incidentally, about a month, more than a month, maybe 5 weeks before you'll see it because I'll be out of town when this comes up, when this is posted. And right now everyone's playing Nahiri the Harbinger and Jeskai control decks, and that card absolutely destroys us, obviously. She can destroy enchantments without much difficulty, and that's a big problem for us. So we run Pithing Needle to help deal with that. We can name her. Granted, Suppression Field hates on her a little bit, but she can still use her ability. They just have to pay 2 extra mana. When an ability is free, it's not nearly as big a deal to add 2 costs to it, unless the deck doesn't run much mana, but the Harbinger decks do. So that's why we have Pithing Needles. We have 1 Journey to Nowhere. Basically, against an aggro deck, we side out 1 Oblivion Ring and in a 3rd Journey to Nowhere because Oblivion Ring's kind of clunky against them. And Journey to Nowhere is really important because it can buy us time to make sure we win the game just by killing a creature early. We have 2 Ground Seals for use against Grishol brand decks and against any deck that runs Snapcaster Mage. You bring it in as well because you turn off their Snapcasters. Also turns off Goblin Dark Dwellers. So it's hate against a lot of decks in the format. We have 2 Auras of Silence to be put in against artifact-based decks, whether they're like Tezzerator or Tezzerator with Thopter Foundry or Affinity. Aura of Silence is very good. We can also destroy stuff. Occasionally you encounter enchantments too, but the bad news about Aura of Silence is a lot of other people have it in their sideboard, and it's very good against us. We have 2 Nevermores, and this is one of our ways of stopping combo decks like Ad Nauseam. Any deck that relies primarily on 1 or 2 cards to win the game, if we can name Nevermore and shut it off, they're in a lot of trouble. We have 2 Story Circles. This is for against Burn. Burn is a deck that does not care that much about attacking. We can slow them down some by keeping them from attacking, but they just start firing Burn at our face. But if we can turn it off with Story Circle, it's pretty great. And then we have 2 Chokes against any deck that runs a large number of islands. Choke is very good. And finally, for another one of the combo decks that doesn't care about attacking, we also have Curse of Exhaustion for Storm, Pyromancer's Ascension. It's also good against any deck running Bring to Light, which people are running to a certain extent right now in Modern. And it's also good against any deck that wants to be playing multiple spells a turn, which is most, really. There's a lot of matchups where you have other cards in your deck that just aren't that good. against them, like maybe Ghostly Prison, and bringing in the Curse is a fine sort of replacement, because if you're making it so they can only cast their one Serum Visions a turn or something, it's pretty good. So that's the deck. I'll play 5 matches with it now against Tier 1 opponents. It's a pretty sweet deck. It's budget. It's very fun to play. If you like having the kind of turns where you have 3 or 4 triggers go off and you're drawing tons of cards and your opponent's just staring at you, this is the right deck to play. If you don't want your opponent to get mad at you, it might not be the right deck to play. But so that's the deck. I hope you enjoy the 5 matches as well. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.